Hello and welcome to Chess Goblin. In this video, we will be looking at a game played between Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura. Currently, it's July 3rd, 2024. And this game was played during the 7th round of the Norway chess tournament. This is a very strong chess tournament consisting of 6 players, Magnus Hikaru, along with world champion Deng Liren, Indian chess prodigy Pragdananda, and 2 other chess greats, Alireza and Fabiano. The way this tournament works is it's a double round robin, so each person plays everybody else twice. Classical game with white and black, and if the game happens to be a draw, then they go to an Armageddon match. And this is the game between Hikaru and Magnus. And Hikaru with b4, and it transpires to a classical Nimso Indian. And if any of you watched the game that happened yesterday between Hikaru and Fabiano, Hikaru then played e3, and Fabiano played this interesting line where he actually puts his bishop on a6. But instead of playing this e3 line, Hikaru decides to play this f3 line. And the idea of that is to prevent Magnus's knight from jumping out and then later pushing this e-pawn to create a strong white center. And that is exactly what he planned on doing until Magnus puts his d-pawn out. And the idea of this is to prevent Hikaru's pawn out, but also just blowing up the center that Hikaru is working to try to solidify. And here, we see Hikaru trying to kick back Magnus's knight. We see a trade-off, and then Magnus puts another pawn in the center. And it might look like it's not protected and not a very great pawn. You could capture, but that's actually not great, because then, for white, Hikaru's whole queenside board is the pawn structure is destroyed. He has 3 isolated pawns that will be easily picked up by Magnus anytime he wants later in the game. But Hikaru finds the right move, capturing Magnus's d-pawn, and then after we see a trade of pawns here, now Hikaru still has these isolated pawns. And because these isolated pawns are such weaknesses, it's kind of a problem for Hikaru. Even though he's up a pawn in this position, it's a weakness that may affect him later in the game. And then Magnus brings out his queen, attacking his pawns, and Hikaru tries to kick out Magnus' knight. And although this pawn may look free here, it's not actually a great move, because after Hikaru pushes his queen forward, defending against Magnus's queen, Magnus has to defend his queen with his knight, and then we see this bishop move here, and then after you retreat your knight, we see a trade of queens here, and then Hikaru can take the pawn here on g7, attacking Magnus's rook, and then these knights here are kind of trapped. These bishops cover so many squares, it's going to be hard to move your knights out, and the knights on the rail, these 2 knights right here, they're going to be a problem for Magnus later in the game. And since these pawns on the c-file aren't a huge threat to Magnus, he plays the right move and then just retreats his knight. Hikaru develops his bishop out to try to protect this pawn, and then Magnus castles. Hikaru pushes his queen, we see a rook moving over, and then the queen moves over there. And then we see this move, knight to the rail, by Magnus. And the idea of this is to put more pressure on the c5 pawn. He could have moved his knight over to d7 to attack it too, but it doesn't really matter. It's pretty much the same move either way. And then we see this move from Hikaru moving his knight to the rail also. And the idea of this is to put his knight back on f2 right here, and then it doesn't block in this light squared bishop. Because if he would develop it just his knight straight out to e2 here, it blocks in this light squared bishop, and it's a very uncomfortable position for white. So instead he moves it to the rail, and then we see this pawn push by Magnus, and Hikaru brings his knight back into the center. Then we see Magnus connecting his rooks, opening up his bishop. We see kind of a development of pieces, and not a lot's happening here. They're just shuffling their pieces, and then they just decide on a draw by repetition. And it's not a very exciting game. Not a lot happened, and they just shuffled their pieces and went for a draw. Right here, their kings are both fairly safe. Hikaru has this pawn chain, but there's no clear motive on an attack plan for either person in this position, so they just decided to just be done with this classical game and just head straight to the Armageddon. So here we go. Let's head to the Armageddon. Alrighty, now we're here at the Armageddon. Hikaru has the white pieces, and Magnus has the black pieces. Hikaru will have 10 minutes to play, and Magnus has 7. And there is no increment of per move until move 41. After move 41, you only get 1 second of increment per move. And because of the time control in this situation, controlling your time and managing it is going to be very important in this game. And Hikaru decides to play d4 again and head back into a Nimso Indian. Play the exact same game he just played. Even though he didn't have a great attacking strategy, he decides to play it again. In this Armageddon match, Hikaru needs to win. The way Armageddons work is for white, you have to win the game to get the point. And black, they give them less time, but if black manages to pull off a draw, black is considered the winner. So, as Magnus right here, he's just going, Hikaru has to win. But instead of bringing his bishop out, he decides to just go straight to the center. This is kind of like a queen's gambit decline kind of setup here. And then we see a trade-off of the pawns. And then just developing pieces. Breaking up this pen that Hikaru placed here against the queen, and then opening up the line for him to castle. And then we see this move here to try to free up his bishop. Let's draw these arrows straight to free up the bishop. And then he's kicking back Hikaru's knight, or his bishop, and then moves this bishop out here, which seems a little counterintuitive, because can't just white push this f-pawn and then you have to retreat your bishop? Yes. But the point of moving his bishop down to g4 was to have Hikaru push this pawn. And the reason why he wanted Hikaru to push this pawn is because it's very uncomfortable and you can't develop your knight as quickly out to the center. And this pawn structure is a very uncomfortable pawn structure for white, and that was the idea of moving the bishop out. And then Hikaru develops his bishop, and then Magnus pushing this pawn again, trying to blow up the center, and then we just see some slow development pieces. They both castle, and then they both move their rooks over, and then Magnus moves his second rook over. Then we're slowly developing pieces, and then we see the first capture. And there's so many pieces in the center, this will be a very interesting game. And here, Hikaru decides to capture this bishop right away, which is the best move here, because if he took this pawn right away, Magnus can actually temporarily sack his knight, because Hikaru can't take back, or Magnus then finds this pen, pinning Hikaru's queen to his king. So he can't take back this pawn. So he creates initiative, where he attacks Magnus's queen. So Magnus has to deal with that threat first, by capturing back with a knight, and then Hikaru takes the pawn. And he thinks, Magnus here, thinks that Hikaru overlooked the part that there'll be a pen here, and now Hikaru's down a pawn. Because he's still down a pawn this way. But Hikaru finds the best move, attacking Magnus's rook, and then bringing this bishop back here to kick this knight out of here. And this bishop is an important piece later in the game, remember that. Later in the game, this bishop he placed here will be an important piece. After he kicks back the knight, now Hikaru wins back the pawn. And here, this position looks kind of uncomfortable for Magnus. For Hikaru has two pieces kind of pushed up tight, and now Magnus has this isolated queen's pawn. But it is kind of a threat for Hikaru since there's no pawn on either side to try to stop this d-pawn later in the game. And he pushes. And then Hikaru moves his knight, and then Magnus develops his bishop. And for white here, this looks a little unsettling because he'll later have this pawn push, and this knight feels under attack. So a natural move is either moving it up to f4 or over to g3. And Hikaru finds the best move, moving it to f4, with future ideas of developing it maybe with a fork here, or developing it here to try to attack the king more. And Magnus plays an inaccurate move, trying to move his knight over here. And that was one of the reasons why Hikaru put his knight here, is to prevent Magnus's knight from coming here. And Magnus overlooks that and makes a mistake. And then Hikaru, instead of trading off knights or defending his knight, he instead sacrifices his knight with this brilliant move. And this brilliant move, Magnus cannot really escape from, because his knight is getting attacked by two places. And if he decides to just trade off knights, Hikaru has this move with his rook, this great move, where it's a revealed attack on the king, and he will end up picking up Magnus's queen. And if he tries to defend his knight, say with this other knight here, Hikaru can just try to kick his knight away, and then he'll end up losing one of these knights, because he can't defend them both. And Magnus, knowing that he's been in this trouble here, he takes the knight, because that's the only option he really has, and then he hopes that this trade-off, he has Hikaru's knight and his rook in exchange for a queen, he hopes that'll work out later in the game. But with this many pieces on the board, having someone, your opponent, having a queen against you is very difficult to play against. And then Hikaru picks up another one of Magnus's pawns. And now Magnus's hope here in this position is this d-pawn. Because Hikaru doesn't have the pawns on the outside of it, doesn't have the other d-pawn in front of it, and if he can push this pawn to the end, Magnus will have great winning chances. And then Hikaru pulls his bishop back, and then we see a couple pawn pushes here. And now he's kind of attacking Hikaru's bishop here. But Magnus does not want to trade off pieces here, because heading into an endgame when your opponent has a queen is not a good idea. And then we see a couple of shuffling pieces around. If we look at the eval bar, Hikaru is up 3.9, almost 4 better than Magnus. He is way ahead of Magnus in this position. And if we look at the clocks, Hikaru has been managing his clock a lot better. If we look back at several of those past moves, Hikaru is playing quite a bit quicker than Magnus in these positions. And then he brings his knight around. Now Hikaru brings his rook in to add more pressure to this pawn and try to prevent it coming down. And the reason why he couldn't push this in the past is this bishop that Hikaru placed here many moves ago to try to hold off this pawn that was to be pushed. This pawn, the reason why Magnus couldn't push it all those moves ago is because then we have a trade of bishops, and that works very negatively for Magnus here. But he can't really avoid that, and over a bunch more moves that happened, he eventually had to move the pawn and traded off bishops. And because his bishop is off the board, Magnus then loses his a-pawn, because the bishop was the only good piece that was able to protect it. And then we see another trade of pieces. Magnus is just trading off pieces even though it's bad because Hikaru's got a queen up. This eval bar should be like 4. It's terrible. It's going up and down a little bit. It's going crazy. We'll turn that off for a second and see if it can adjust. And then Magnus tries to bring his rooks over. His only hope is to push this pawn to the end to try to queen against Hikaru and hopefully get some advantage. And if we look at these clocks, Hikaru has over 3 minutes, where Magnus has less than 1. Magnus is struggling under the time pressure here. But then he tries to attack this knight. But instead, Magnus just pushes his pawn. And this is an important position here. The move that Hikaru has to find is king f1. Because now Magnus no longer has this rook move, because then you just trade it off, and the move that Hikaru was kind of afraid of, the reason why Hikaru blundered here, Hikaru did not find the F move, and the reason why, Hikaru was afraid of if Magnus move his knight here, because this rook is later coming down, and if you capture the pawn, then this rook is coming down, and this looks kind of scary for white. After we see a trade here, now black has 2 rooks against Magnus's king. And although Hikaru didn't see the eval bar, because he's got 2 pawns over here, and we turn on the evaluation again, Hikaru is completely winning here. And there's several ways that this could, like, he doesn't even have to take back the knight. If he goes here, he can actually move here, attacking Magnus's rook. And he's 10-11 better. He's completely winning in this position, but Hikaru doesn't see this eval bar. Instead, Hikaru plays this blunder. And now all of a sudden, all the advantage that Hikaru had before is almost gone. And Magnus finds the right move. And in fact, he cannot capture this rook. Because then there's this fork, forking the king and the queen. And you can't try to move your queen out of the way, really. And that's just really bad also, because then you have queen e1. And now this pawn is really, there's a lot of pressure down here, and Hikaru is completely losing. This is technically the best move, and the only move that white can play in this position. And then you attack right here. And these attacks are just so strong, white is just destroyed. And after finding out that Hikaru blundered, he knew that he blundered here. He had to do a ditch effort and sacrifice the queen. This was his only move that he could play here. Every other move is terrible. This is bad also, but it keeps it a kind of an even game, because after we see this trade of queens, a trade of rook versus queen, Hikaru has 3 pawns in exchange for Magnus's knight. But Magnus only has 24 seconds on the clock. Hikaru has over a minute on the clock. And Hikaru has to push the clock, hoping that the king of endgames, the guy who created endgames, blunders and an endgame. He's traded off all his pieces, and now Hikaru decides to play against created endgames himself. 3 pawns for a knight. And theoretically, this should be a draw, because these 2 pawns over here, the knight can sacrifice himself on these pawns, and then 3 pawns versus 2 pawns, and both players have a rook, is a theoretical endgame, is a theoretical draw, if the players played right. And you can't really expect that Magnus plays anything less than that. So Hikaru's really got to push these queen's pawns. These queenside pawns, he's got to push if he wants a chance here. And then he's pushing them and bringing his rook over. And now we hit the 41st move. Now Magnus and Hikaru will be gaining 1 second per move. But only having 18 seconds is not a lot of time to think on your move to work with. And then they're bringing their kings in. And they're pushing. And now Hikaru's lost all his advantage here. And Magnus is finding all the best moves. Brings his king in. Hikaru now is trying to bring his king over onto the king's side of the board to attack these pawns. Because all these pawns here, he can't move this one on the A file or he loses it. He can't move this one over here or he loses it. He can't make any ground over here on the queen side of the board. So he has to try to work on the king's side of the board to try to get one of these pawns to pass. And now Magnus pushes his pieces. And all Magnus needs in this position is a draw. If he gets a draw in this position, he wins and Hikaru loses the match. Hikaru still has to fight for the win and pushes his pawns. And now the Black King is breaking into the position. And now it's looking very drawy. Completely drawy. We can't really push these pawns. It's hard over here, but Magnus has 2 seconds on the clock. If Magnus can hope, or if Hikaru can hope that Magnus blunders in this position with only 2 seconds on the clock, Magnus has to play instantly every move to keep himself from being flagged here. And then the king gets in. But the king can't really capture this pawn, or we win the knight. For example, say we push this pawn, and Magnus captures this a pawn here. Now, after we get the knight, Hikaru can just pull back his rook. And now, since the king is blocked on the queen side of the board, the pawns over on this side will fall, and Hikaru is completely winning this endgame. So Magnus cannot capture this a pawn yet. Hikaru trades off another pawn. And then here, the move that Hikaru should play is King h4. King h4, and he is fine. He's fine, and he pushes these pawns, and he's okay. But he thinks about the move King h5. After Magnus takes his pawn, Hikaru takes the other pawn, and then Magnus takes this last pawn, and then Hikaru went from winning the game to he could be losing the game. And Hikaru decides to play this. But it ended up, Magnus thought on this move 2 seconds too long, and ended up being flagged by Hikaru. Even if he did take this pawn, and it went on, Hikaru is now losing his advantage. These pawns are very weak now. But Hikaru was lucky that all those blitz games he plays online have paid off, and he was learning to play fast, and ended up flagging the #1 player in the world and winning the Armageddon match. And I don't think the standings have came out yet. I don't know if all the games have finished. I think they have, but they haven't updated for the standings. But the standings will be, Magnus will be leading the tournament by half a point ahead of Hikaru. And there's 3 games left in the tournament. And I believe that these last 3 classical games, Magnus and Hikaru push very hard to try to win these last classical games. Magnus really wants to win the tournament in his hometown. And Hikaru won this Norway chess tournament last year. And he is doing very well in this tournament and will be pushing to win these classical games also. If you have enjoyed this video, please hit that like button down below and subscribe if you have not already done before. It really helps. I hope to see you in the next video.